Hello. Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin our session by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands we are all streaming in from today and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that in Australia we're on stolen land and sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Shannon King. I'm the director of Brisbane Queer Film Festival, streaming in from Meanjin on the lands of Yuggera Turrbal people. And we'd like to welcome you to our Q&A session with the director and cast of Disclosure. This online gathering is made possible with the teams from Queer Screen, Melbourne Queer Film Festival, and Brisbane Queer Film Festival. We are truly humbled to be joining together to bring you this live stream. The three of our festivals not only share a love of all things queer cinema and a very close family bond, but also a responsibility to our communities to continue to bring us all together, sharing our stories no matter what. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa Rose. I am the Festival Director for Queer Screen in Sydney. I just wanted to go through a few little housekeeping sort of things. So because we wanted to reach the widest audience we possibly could with this fantastic Q&A, people can watch in multiple ways. So if you are here with us in the Zoom webinar, if you have a question that you want to ask, you should see a Q&A box that you can click on and ask a question in there so our moderator can see it. Please don't post any questions in the chat, but you can of course chat to your fellow attendees in the chat and create some community. If you're watching the live stream on Facebook, then just post any questions that you have within the live stream chat box, and that will be relayed across to the moderator. And if you're watching on Twitter, or not watching on Twitter, but following along on Twitter, you can on the hashtag Disclosure Q&A. There will be quotes being pulled by Melbourne Queer, and if you have any questions, you can use the hashtag or just DM Melbourne Queer Film Festival, which is at MQFF. And we'll be running the panel to finish up at midday or just before.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Lisa. My name's Spiro Konomopoulos, and I'm the Program Director for the Melbourne Queer Film Festival. I'm here to introduce our moderator for today, Cerise Howard. Cerise is a co-curator at the Melbourne Cinematheque, is also a writer and film critic. Cerise is also the studio leader at RMIT University, specialising in incubating film festivals and contesting the canon. Cerise is also one of the co-founders of Tilda, the trans and gender diverse film festival in Melbourne. And outside of the film world is the basis for queer punk band Queen Kong and the Homo Sapiens, and was also the bass player for Gender Euphoria during the Melbourne International Arts Festival season in 2019. Oh, how I miss you. Okay, that's enough from me, and over to Cerise. Thank you.
Thank you, Spiro. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Shannon. And hello, everyone. And it's a real privilege to be here today for this Disclosure Q&A. When I say today, I mean Saturday, Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney time, but it is yesterday for all of the guests I am now going to introduce in turn. It is my great pleasure to begin with the director of the documentary Disclosure. In fact, perhaps I should just pull back just one moment. I'll actually just explain. I shouldn't just presume that you've all seen Disclosure. It is readily viewable. It is a documentary streaming presently on Netflix, and it looks at issues of representation of trans folk historically, presently, and intersectionally, with a special interest on where issues of representation of a marginalised community, which I am most certainly a member myself, issues of authenticity and representation, who gets to tell our stories and how are they received, how have they been received, and how do they intersect with other key matters of identity and in particular in this documentary, I think race. It's a very timely intersectional view of where things are at with trans representation, especially in light of Black Lives Matters and Black Trans Lives Matters events around the world. So I will now throw to the director to introduce to you, the director of Disclosure, to start with, Sam Fader. Sam, hi, how are you?
Hi, How are you? Thank you so much for organizing this panel. It's really nice to be in conversation with you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here, Sam. I will now also introduce the producer of the documentary, Amy Scholder. Hi, Amy, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having us.
It is all of our great pleasure. Thank you. And we also are very fortunate to have 3 members of the extraordinary cast you were assembled for this documentary. I will introduce first of all actress and writer, seen in Tales of the City and the web series Her Story, Jen Richards. Hi, Jen. How are you, Jen? You're muted at the moment.
Hi, that's better.
Yeah. Hi. And joining us all now, may I introduce actor, seen in L-Word Generation, Q, and recent film Adam, Leo Sheng. Welcome, Leo.
Hi. Thanks.
Hi, Leo. And lastly, but not least, Alexandra Gray, actress and musician, seen in Empire and in Transparent, amongst many other roles. Alexandra, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's wonderful to have you all here. We have a tremendous amount to talk about. I think Disclosure is an incredibly timely documentary. Whether we could say that that's necessarily a matter of good fortune or that there are events in the wider world around us that are not necessarily particularly fortunate, but that have brought to light a number of societal ills for greater mainstream awareness, I think. One of the starting points for your documentary is that trans people have never been more visible, but with that can also come a backlash, and that has been a fear for I think many of us, that the more confident we become in being ourselves and the more we put ourselves out there, the more risk we might run of encountering resistance to our authentic selves, as sad as that may be. The very title of this film, Disclosure, hints at anxieties around our being ourselves and being open with who we are. Sam, if I may throw to you first, the term disclosure, what does that mean to you? What weight does that term carry for you?
The term disclosure really is about this really unfair, like for lack of a better word, assumption that trans people owe something to the people they're coming in contact with. And most readily that they owe some sort of explanation of who they're showing up as, right? To either explain that they're trans or explain that there's something other than what they're claiming to be and what the person that they're in contact with sees them to be. And as Jen says so beautifully in the film, it really prioritizes the other person's experience and feelings over one's own. And often what we see in film and TV, and we also see in off the screen as well, is that once there's this moment of disclosure, violence ensues. And it's been framed in our culture that this is an acceptable reaction, and that because we've hidden something that needs to be disclosed, then we deserve to be punished for it.
And Amy, you're coming on board this project too. Are you coming from a similar perspective? And was it your role in particular to assemble the extraordinary cast in this film?
Well, I came on board this project about 6 months into Sam's work. I met Sam through his last film, Kate Bornstein is a Queer in Pleasant Danger. I saw it, Sam, was at 2014 when it first was premiering in New York. Kate's a dear friend of mine and an author that I work with. I have a background in publishing and have spent my kind of calling and my career elevating the voices of queer and underserved storytellers, including Kate and Justin Vivian Bond and Sapphire and June Jordan and Kathy Acker and David Wojnarowicz, and have been kind of working to bring those storytellers to the fore. And when I met Sam through his film, which I thought was just extraordinary and beautiful. And if you all haven't seen it, you must. And then I learned about Sam's next project, which is what became Disclosure. I realized, first of all, how important and necessary this project would be, and that it's a history that's never been made. That Sam's kind of vision and integrity and brilliance would ensure that this would be extraordinarily told. And I was at a point in my life where I was able to say, you know, what can I do? How can I help? And so Sam's team of one became a team of two when I joined, and then a few years later when we met Laverne Cox, and she wanted to become a creative partner, then it became clear that this was going to be an extraordinary project, and I feel so proud to be part of it.
And so, for example, Jen, how did you come on board this? Was you one of the, you know, a very articulate speaker about trans matters, and you are, I mean, all of you have enacted, you know, have, I think, as a matter of course, for many trans performers, had to enact roles that, looking through a historical lens, or perhaps even felt in the moment, can't help but be about matters of disclosure, and that you can't help but perhaps problematize even as you're having to perform them, in the quest that we be better understood, that our stories are told, that now that transness is so often the story rather than, say, a trans character being just incidentally trans. So if I can throw to you perhaps first, Jen, for your thoughts on the take of how prominent transness is in our narratives, and having to disclose that as a matter of storytelling necessity, seemingly.
You said it very well in your question. And to answer the first part, I was one of the original people that Sam interviewed as part of the research when he was first assembling this film. And I was hyper invested from the start. Many of us who are actors or writers who are in some way involved in the creative industries have to also double as activists, as advocates, just to fight for our own space to do the things that we love. And Sam's film, it was evident right from the start, was going to be a massive contribution to that conversation. And now I can tell it's even a demarcation point where I feel like everything is now different after Disclosure. But then what you said is exactly right. Many of the roles that I've had to perform, I'm sure that Alexandra has had to perform, and perhaps Leo as well, have been ones that where our characters are kind of reduced to their transness. That was their only function in there. We're often there because our transness is somehow problematized, as in Alexandra's cases on several medical shows that she talks about in the film. Or I was often there in order for a main character to have some kind of moral lesson that my transness had something to do with. And that can be done in a good way. It's often very tactful and artistic. I mean, trans people do have a certain kind of experience that requires a degree of self-awareness and interrogation, and, you know, battling of external hostilities. And that can be a kind of interesting lesson that a trans person has to impart onto others. And it can sometimes just be a cheap plot point and a twist. And so hopefully it gets better. I think as the film shows that it's certainly getting better, the more that trans people are involved in the creative process, both behind and in front of the camera, the more complex these narratives can become, and the less likely trans people are going to be reduced to that one single aspect of their identity.
Alexandra, you gave a couple of quite sort of comical, in a gallows humor sort of way, examples where you had two roles within, was it even the same day where you had to play somebody?
Yeah, well, yeah, both. I was actually doing a music tour as well that summer, and I remember looking at the TV guide and I saw that both of the episodes were airing like the day after each other. So of course, Twitter kind of lit me up. They said, look out for Alexandra Gray, because the next role, you know, she's gonna have prostate cancer. So, you know, it was really, really difficult, because I mean, it was one of like the first, you know, second gigs that I booked in Hollywood. So, I mean, I'm not in any position to turn anything down. But I also was just so young. I think now I've grown so much as an artist where, you know, that being there, I was so excited. It's like, oh my gosh, this is one of my first jobs, you know. So you don't really, I wasn't really focused on like, wow, these storylines are actually the same. So yeah, that was a bit interesting.
Yeah. And Leo, transmasculine characters are more seldom seen. This is something that comes up in the documentary quite clearly. Do you feel the burden of representation, would you imagine, any greater than your trans feminine colleagues, or do you feel that we're all shouldering a similar load?
I think we're all shouldering our own loads, and you know, we are definitely, I think we all carry various parts of responsibility in different ways. I think it's kind of easy to get into like a comparison mindset and a lot of like Hollywood storytelling. Like so for me, just like background, up until maybe last year, I'd even say 2016, I've lived my life as an audience member. I've lived my life as like a trans person who is also consuming media rather than being part of it. At least in this way, you know, I used to do a lot of writing, free writing for different platforms, and this is the last couple of years is really the only when I started to become aware of it in a way that I wasn't before. So I went from consuming it to being a part of it, and like having this double layer of like what goes into it and what it looks like. And what I feel like I say, or like what I think about a lot, is that when I filmed my first role at all, it was in 2016, and like late 2016, and the OA I believe had aired, but it hadn't gained the, I think, fan base that season 2 brought. And so Ian Alexander, Chella Mann, Skylar Baylor, like these are names that I think in the last couple of years people have really started to see, and like see like Asian trans men exist, Asian trans men or Asian folks of transmasculine experience. And I also want to point out Kit Yan, who is probably more known in like literary writing circles probably. But for me, like it's really hard to separate transmasculine representation from Asian transmasculine representation, because that's what I'm bringing. That's kind of, it's an inherent piece of me. It's not really a skill because it's just who I am, but it's what I'm bringing with me to every job, every audition, every pitch, or whatever it's given to me. And so I keep that in mind. I definitely keep that in mind with when I'm presented with something. I've turned a few things down when I didn't think that they would end well, or didn't think that they would portray things in a way that I'm hoping to portray transmasculine folks in my experience and in my line of my trajectory. And so I guess just to answer your question, I do feel like there's a lot of pressure. I feel like with the L word, that's something we talked about from the very beginning, is understanding that although there is an increase in transmasculine representation, there's still going to be a lot of people for whom this is the first entryway into transmasculine storylines or storytelling. And so how are we going about it in a way that is acknowledging of the fact that my character Micah's experiences are not cannot be applicable to like every Asian trans person. And so it's very much a fine line of wanting to be responsible and also just trying to figure out the best thing in the moment, and that'll carry on in a good way, hopefully.
Well, Sam, if I can throw back to you. So there's this question, and everyone here feels it, I don't doubt, this question of responsibility, and a sense that yes, we need more positive representation of trans and gender diverse peoples. And yet, I think to really arrive at a maturity as a culture, or as, this might sound utopian, but a lot of the problematic depictions that we all grew up with and sometimes first identified ourselves as trans through are perhaps a sort of villain, villainous roles, or the full breadth of performance and representation and depiction is kind of denied to us, arguably, while we try to make sure that there's enough positive representation in the first instance of our marginalized selves. I think you more than touch on this in the film. You look at a lot of historical footage, and going back even to early cinema. How do you feel about that responsibility? Do you feel that burden upon you as a filmmaker telling such a story that is looking through all the history of representation of trans people and where it is intersected with race, do you really, does that bear down upon you? Okay, you're muted, sorry, Sam.
You were breaking up a little bit, so I just didn't get the actual question. If you could restate the question again.
Oh, sure. Just with the thirst we all have for positive representation of trans people, perhaps there's also a thirst for a breadth of representation, in as much as that, you know, it would be wonderful if we could be serial killers again. You know, that sounds perverse perhaps, but while we still need that positive representation to remove a lot of stereotypes and damaging images that have gone before us, for as long as we still need cheerleading roles, perhaps we cannot arrive at a maturity as a culture until we are able to actually once more present a gamut of identities and possibilities for characterizations. Do you feel that?
Do I feel that? You know, so let's see.
Do you want me to jump in, Sam? I think I know what Teresa's trying to say.
You know, I think what Jen has a beautiful line in the film where she talks about the one word answer to the problem of representation is more, right? We just need more. And then if we have more representation, the clumsy representations, the clumsy moments wouldn't, you know, be as damaging. But I often remember when people are talking about this issue of, you know, whether we need, you know, that we want all the stories, I can't help but think about the conversations that were happening when I was in undergrad in the early 90s, where people were questioning women's studies departments. And I don't mean changing women's studies to gender studies. This is way before even that debate. Just why have a women's studies department? Why have, you know, an African or a Black studies department, right? Everything should just be history. And it was this idea that was ignoring the power dynamic of our culture, right? And so you can't have this ideal version that we're going to include everyone in our history when our culture doesn't operate that way. So it's a similar conversation of, until there's some semblance of trans people having some power in this culture, or being centered, you know, or being given the opportunities to tell their own stories, like, there is going to be this huge amount of pressure. There is a huge amount of responsibility of every representation that we see. You know, and I think one easy trick when you're watching a television show is to say, is anything happening to that person that doesn't have to do with them being trans? And usually you're going to walk away with saying, no, everything. I mean, like, I think of that beautiful film, A Fantastic Woman, beautiful, but every single thing that happened to her was because she was trans. And so for me, like, I walked out of that movie feeling like, okay, everyone's happy because a non-trans person can watch this and feel bad for her and then feel good for themselves, right? It had that sort of access of empathy and victimhood and pity, which I actually do not think is progress. And so until we start to see characters that, you know, I mean, I do my laundry, you know, I go to the farmer's market, like, those things have nothing to do with me being trans. So I think that when we're talking about the responsibility, like, that is the first step I'd like to see before we say, you know, let's see all the roles. Let's see the serial killer. Not ready for that yet.
Yeah. So
Jen, did you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, you said it perfectly, Sam, which is the same thing. It's a matter of the trans people having power in those moments. Part of it's not just that, you know, there was this rash of trans people portrayed as serial killers. It's that those stories were written, directed, produced, performed, and marketed to non-trans people. That trans people were not part of that equation whatsoever. I would love to play a villain. I would love to write a villain. I would love to write those complicated characters. It's not a matter of just having positive portrayals. It's a matter of our agency and our power in the system.
Yeah, terrific. All right. And on that, you know, bouncing off that, it came up for a number of people that part of their identification in the documentary, part of their self-identification, their coming to awareness as being trans was through only seeing those quite negative representations at first. And there's that really interesting tension between people seeing, like, Dress to Kill was an example in the film, you know, this Brian De Palma slasher flick with Angie Dickinson perishing because Michael Caine inexplicably suddenly dressed in drag murders her, you know, as happens. So, and yet a sense of, oh, but you know, she was, you know, I'm Angie. I too grew up with such problematic identifications. I wonder if the rest of you felt that as acutely as well. Is that something that you are mindful of in those times when you have been cast in roles? For example, Alexandra, you know, when you have been consigned to being a character perishing in hospital again, or you know, the victim trope is very common in trans narratives, whether it's directly associated with the transition as being perilous to a human being or just simply being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it kind of works in like two ways, right? I think I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and I was just saying, I wonder if we didn't have like 30 seasons of Jerry Springer, I wonder if the perception of everyone else, of trans people, would be a lot different, right? Like, so, and I think that's what's obviously so important about this film too, is that the media has played such a major part in how people view us. You know what I mean? They're just negative portrayals all the time. And if all you see, even in 2016, back when I did that, is me playing a cancer patient who has prostate cancer, right? You know what I mean? And I'm super grateful, right? Like I want to be very clear about that, right? But we have to, you know, talk about these things. So I think that it's like the negative portrayals just they don't help, right? I can't speak for myself, right? I have had a very different upbringing, right? So for me, I couldn't even deal with being trans because I was too busy dodging bullets. So, you know, but for someone else coming up now, right, where this conversation is moving, you know, they are looking towards the media, right? And I'm so glad that we are starting to get it right, and we have shows that are showing positive portrayals, but we just need more, right? Like, and my part is I have to speak on behalf of girls that look like me, right? The Black trans woman, right? Because we get murdered a lot. And so it's like, I don't see enough of us, right? You know what I mean? Like, I know we got a lot of trans characters, a lot of diversity. We're really doing really good, but I need to see more, right? I need to see the Black trans doctor, the Black trans preacher, the Black trans mom. I need to see all of this type of stuff. So it's like, we have to do more because people they won't start to see us as quote unquote normal, but you know, unless they can see it. And I'll just say this one little point is that I have a lot of cis friends, right? And, you know, I was hanging out with one of my cis guy friends, and, you know, he had brought up Laverne Cox, you know, and he had said, you know, she's a boss, you know, like he had so much respect for her, right? And, you know, I was just like, and I wonder what, if more people got to see us be a boss, right? Or whatever you want to call it, or just be normal. I wonder if that perception might not be different, right? And people might be like, yo, these are just people. So.
Yeah, well, all of you have had to combine, you know, you don't really get a choice, activism with your roles in the creative industries. You know, I'll cross to you in this case, Leo, do you feel that tension between an obligation to community and to positive representation, but do you ever feel a tension with that, with you know, perhaps even a resentment that we as a community have to do all that heavy lifting, that our allies, whoever they may be, are not doing it for us? I mean, do you feel that at all, or is that just me?
I'm smiling really hard and my heart's pounding a lot because I had a little Twitter thread on this the other day, where I was just kind of giving a very vague, very, you know, quick overview of the fact that like being a Chinese trans guy in Hollywood is fucking weird. To say even to say that I'm in Hollywood is really weird to me. But it's I think, Alexandra made a really good point about feeling gratitude towards roles that have, in many ways, and may have, guided us to where we are now. And so I think a lot about when I took my first role and the things I've learned since then. And this is something that I've talked about in many trans circles, and there is a lot of controversy around Adam, and there still is. And I think your question feels very applicable to this because there were a lot of trans folks who enjoyed the film and felt like it was very representative of a certain time period in certain circles. And there were folks who didn't feel that way and felt like it really misrepresented trans folks, and that there are a few more issues with it. And it's something like, obviously I can't ignore. Like, yes, I'm grateful to Reese for giving me a chance. I had no acting experience. And I think it's important that we like acknowledge that it goes with your question, and it goes with something Drew Gregory from Autostraddle said very well, is that representation will feel different for everybody. Some folks may love something, some folks may not. And so I think that's part of this obligation is kind of never really, it's kind of, trying to find the right direction and where community is saying that we should be, and also like doing what I can with what I'm being given and have opportunity and access to. And I think there's a lot to be said for, for me, I'm in the very many fair criticisms I'm getting, what I notice is like, it's coming from predominantly like white trans masculine people. And I'm like, well, why am I the only like visible trans person of color from that film getting this? I'm then being told it's my responsibility to speak for this entire film. Sorry, I'm really nervous talking about this upfront about it. I have not done it like this before. And it's, so it is, it's, thanks, Anne. It butts heads with my identity as a trans person, but as an Asian trans person, very much. I think there are a lot of hopes and a lot of expectations and fears and just a lot of desires put onto trans representation. And there's still such a disconnect between the ways that race and ability status and every other marginalized identity that plays in with gender plays into that. And so that's something I do think about a lot. My obligation to broader trans representation, but my obligation to people who also share more similar identities with me. And so I think to answer your question, and it's complicated, and but it's important work, and it's important to have these conversations. I wish and hope that there's more of an understanding and like examination of that for certain community folks.
Yeah. I'm going to, I've got a few questions coming in through the Q&A, and I'll start throwing to some of these. So here's a good one, perhaps for Sam and Amy to begin with. Been asked by a Cadence Bell. My trans collaborators and I experienced intimidation, gaslighting, and sexual harassment on a production recently. Do you think such experiences are fundamentally different from other Me Too experiences, given trans people have to fight harder for representation?
Amy?
Well, I'm going to sidestep that question a little bit to talk about our production model, because it was a commitment that we made at the outset of the film, and it's related to this question. So, which was that Sam said to me early on, I want our production crew to be trans. And I said, okay, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Why not? That shouldn't be hard. And then we proceeded to stick to that goal. When we couldn't hire a trans person, then we would hire a cis person to mentor. We had a fellowship program, and that cis person mentored a trans person who wanted to have on-the-job experience. We compensated everyone as best we could, and that was really a part of our process that we thought would make a better film. We also thought that it would help with this whole notion of like, well, what, how can trans people tell their own stories if they haven't had the work experience and the opportunities? So we would try to give those opportunities. And you know, most gratifying was that we had this incredible experience on set, which was that there wasn't harassment and there wasn't violence and there wasn't disregard and insensitivity. And there was instead learning and talking and discussion. And when there was some kind of conflict or difficulty or challenge or insensitivity, there was an atmosphere to address it. And I feel very proud of that. And I feel like we provided an opportunity for people to work in a kind of violence-free zone that was clearly unusual for a lot of folks. And I encourage everyone who's listening, if you're a maker, to think about, you know, what's the subject of your film and who's behind the camera and how can you make kind of sense of who you hire to make a film with what you're making a film about, and not to listen to plenty of folks said to Sam and me, oh, you know, that's a nice idea to hire trans people, but you know, you really want to hire the best people. And, you know, to like not dignify that response with like an argument, but just to move on and realize they don't get it. And instead to stick to the values around the making and process, and how that process is really going to be reflected in all aspects of the work that you all will see when you see the disclosure.
Sam, I see in the disclosure press kit, you wrote very clearly that that you and Amy committed to 4 rules in your process, and rule 1 was only trans people are featured in the interviews. They are creative consultants and will be paid for their time. This is a key ethical platform, just as, you know, point 1. This is important, right?
Yeah, I mean, for the 2 of those things, 1, trans people are the experts in their own histories, right? And their own experiences and their memories and perspectives. And if you're telling a story about trans people, no one else should really be talking about or for us, for them. And also, you know, when it comes to documentary filmmaking, there's such a history of not paying the participants, because somehow that, you know, cancels out the integrity or the honesty of the film. And it's some sort of leftover imperial sort of like journalistic farce that just doesn't apply to documentary filmmaking, because there's so much editorial that happens no matter what you do. I mean, it goes for, I think, anyone who's part of a documentary, but in particular, when you're making a documentary about a marginalized community where people could be spending their time making money, but you're gonna have them, you know, make your film with you and not compensate them for their time. I think it's just highly unethical. And it's something I've always done. I've always paid the people I work with for the past 17 years. In the beginning, I didn't have the budget, but after the film started to make some money, I then compensated the people I worked with. And I get a lot of pushback. The documentary community is not happy about this. Funders do not support that in your budget. Amy and I had to explain a lot of, like, really explain and bend over backwards explaining why we thought this was important. I'd really like to see that change in the industry. I think it should be a given that the people that were in your film, and I think directors should be fighting for it first and foremost. I mean, regardless of whether a director makes any money off a project, they get cultural capital. That's just inherent, that's happening. So that's, for me, it's a no-brainer that your participants should be paid.
Great, thank you. Another question from Addie Close. Addie writes, I'm an actor and I've seen some problematic examples used in classes and lectures by teachers and industry professionals. I'm trying to find the best way to approach these situations in an educational environment. How do we as students educate our teachers and make these environments a safe and inclusive space? It's quite a curly one. Would anyone like to chime in on that particular conundrum? The need to educate teachers as to what is a safe and inclusive space for trans folk? Because somehow it's often incumbent upon us to do that heavy lifting. Leo, you look like you're game for this.
I think it's a really good question, because I have definitely been in queer-centered classes. I was, for folks who don't know, I was in my first year of grad school for social work, which is also another issue, but also with instructors who were rather insensitive or just like not aware of certain things. And I think that's a really, really, really difficult position to be in. Like, as I just want to I think mostly I just want to validate that is really a difficult position. I don't know. I mean, obviously my go-to always is like talk to GLAAD, but I don't know what that would look like in like a different, in various non-media specific such situations or across environments. I think I just want to validate that I feel like that's hard when people who are supposed to be educating you on something will misspeak or say really, really not great things. I don't know. Beyond that, I'm sorry.
You can have them watch Disclosure now. That's one very simple thing that people can do.
Yeah,
it's so great for us to have this tool. I mean, there have been several times where I took auditions, even though I did not want the part, like where it was a problematic part, just so that I could get in the room and tell the casting director, tell the director, like, this isn't good. Like, this is a bad thing that you are doing. You think you're helping by like a trans character, and you're actually hurting us with this particular depiction. You need to talk to trans people. But no one should have to take that on themselves. Like, I had the privilege of being able to do that because of my age and because I'm white and because I make my living mostly from writing. So I could go in and be, as an actor, just like, no, this is bad. So when you have that opportunity to speak out for other people, take it. If you feel the strength and you can make things better for the next person behind you, go for it. But also, like Leo is recognizing, that's a really hard position, and it isn't always going to be on you, and it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, I mean, the question was about classrooms, but really it's also about being on the same situation must come up on set any number of times in your careers, where you end up having to educate the very people who are employing you. And the power dynamic there isn't necessarily one that gives you a tremendous amount of obvious leverage. So I suppose appeals to common human decency are, the part of the currency you have to employ there. A tricky situation, I should imagine. I'll take another. Is a question from an anonymous attendee who has noted that the wonderful Jamie Clayton has probably played the most famous trans lesbian role on Sense8, and was recently revealed that her lesbian character on the new L Word is cis, which is fab and a great place for us to be. But as trans lesbians are so underrepresented, do you think it's paramount that trans actors play diverse trans roles before the utopia of any roles, so people can feel represented? Alexandra, would you like to chime in there?
Well, I guess I love playing trans roles. I love it. I always will definitely play those, and I think it's very important. I did a movie last year where I played trans, and I just I think it's a little tricky, right? I definitely think we need to have trans roles, right? So because trans people exist in the world, but at the same token, it's like I think we just need to be. We just want to be a part, right? We're normal people as well, so I think it's important to note that if you were to cast, myself or Jen Richards to play, cis, I hope I'm saying the right terms because I didn't go to college. So, if you cast Jen to play cis, right, it's like, just, maybe mention that, there's a trans person who's playing cis, right? One time, right? Mention it one time so that people know, and then people will just know that, well, Jen Richards is a star. We know that she is trans, but she's an actress. And so we just see her as an actress. So it doesn't matter what she plays. And I think that's the goal to get to. So I think, we should have a good balance of both, right? We should still write trans stories, but, we should also cast trans people to play any type of roles, even if they are unconventional and it's like, Alexandra can't have a child, but I could play a mother, you know what I mean? So it's like, why not do that, right? Like, just that's the whole thing. And, let's just be inclusive all around.
Can I jump in on this one? I I can't help but think about when this conversation comes up is, again, going back to power dynamics. It wouldn't even be an issue if trans wasn't seen as lesser than, right? Like, and Jen often talks about, like, no matter what she's cast at, she's still a trans person playing the role. Like, the character is trans no matter what. And I feel like if the center gaze wasn't cis, straight, hetero maleness, like, this wouldn't even be a conversation. So I just question this goal of playing cis as, like, it's just kind of perpetuating this power dynamic that's not helping any of us.
There's a real complexity there, I think, because it's very clear. I know we are not monolithic in our views, and that's something we always do need to get across. But I think generally there's a pretty wide feeling that we don't want cisgender actors playing trans roles, that is too loaded, and historically that has often been egregiously awful, and deprives trans performers from work. So yes, the question of whether it would be utopian that someone's transness can be narratively disappeared in order for them to embody a cisgender character, it's genuinely a curly one. Is it a utopia, or is that strangely dystopian, that we should be erased, that transness should be erased?
Yeah, I don't ever want my transness being erased. I just don't want to be reduced to it. You know, I mean, I always joke that unless you see my character like actually giving birth, she's trans. Like, and I've had plenty of parts where the character's gender identity is never mentioned. It's never made explicit. And some people will be like, oh, she's playing a cis character. Like, and that's the kind of cisnormative thing that Sam's just pointing out. The assumption is, like, unless you explicitly point out that my character is trans, she's somehow magically cis. Like, no, like, that's cisnormativity. That's just the assumption that cis is the default. As far as I'm concerned, like, that my transness can never be erased, and I don't want it to be, unless I was maybe playing a historical character. But I mean, trans people are fascinating. We're really interesting, wonderful people. I want to play trans characters. I want to play us in our full complexity and wonder.
I'll throw to another question. Oh, Sam,
you know what, I just want to, Jen, this question comes up all the time, and Jen and I do a lot of press together. And I think it was just yesterday, you talked about the sort of breakdown of the 3 issues around casting, and you talked about, economic. I'd love that. Would you share that?
Yeah, okay, real quickly, the issue with casting cis people as trans people, it's not a simple thing. Like, in the best of all worlds, I would love for anyone to be able to play anyone. Like, as an artist, I think I want that kind of freedom, both for myself and others, but we don't live in that ideal world. So there's a kind of economic reason to do it, which is trans people need a foothold in the industry. We need to get jobs. Like, we can never get the kind of leading roles that are about, that have great trans characters if we can't play barista number 2 and like all the other roles, behind the scenes. There is a political reason in that when you cast cis men in particular as trans women, you are reinforcing this notion, a very dangerous notion in the public mind, that trans women are ultimately men at the end of the day, which leads to violence. But there's also a simple aesthetic reason, which is when a cis person plays a trans character, they're often playing the transness. Like, that's the part that's interesting to them. And then again, it's a reductive performance. Whereas when a trans person plays that part, the transness is a given. So they get to play the story, they get to play the character, they get to play the relationship dynamics. So there's multiple reasons why we need to include trans people in those opportunities.
Very well said, thank you. A question from, a couple of questions from Adeline Teo. How do Hollywood beauty standards affect the kinds of trans stories being produced by cis media makers? Do you think trans media makers use these standards in the same way, wittingly or unwittingly? Sam or Amy, can I throw to you one or other of you if you'd like to tackle?
I mean, trans people are not immune to making huge mistakes and to doing horrible things. So of course, I mean, there aren't that many trans people getting opportunities to make work. But I think just the first and foremost answer to that question is, of course. I don't know, like, Amy, do you have a deeper?
So Amy, yeah.
No, I don't have a deeper response. I mean, I know, Jen, that you have and expressed a really important kind of point about armor, about adornment, and beauty standards for women and trans women in film. That is an important part of disclosure. Could you summarize it?
The
No.
armor adornment. Well, there's
No, I
a
can't
great part
summarize.
in Disclosure that you can watch. I think it's about 43 minutes.
It's really I think that it's a complicated point, and I do hope your viewers will kind of tune into this part of Disclosure where this very kind of complicated issue is addressed about standards of beauty and where they come from, and who should really be responsible for how, especially how we think about femininity in particular.
But also, it's Hollywood. Hollywood likes beautiful people across the board. Like, that's always been true. It's always going to be true. Ideally, yes, there's room for everybody, and we want to see all kinds of stories told. And the more that trans people are established, the more opportunities those will be. But yeah, absolutely. Your top people are usually going to be your most beautiful people. That's Western culture. We're a very visual culture. We have been since Mycenaean Greece and early Egypt. Like, it's in our DNA at this point.
I think too, it's like, I don't know, maybe it's a given, but I feel like, the standards, Western standards of beauty, specifically Western standards of beauty, are also very tied to like cis normativity and like the ways I think you often see when trans people are cast. I think casting directors, with whatever their intentions are, end up casting people who often could be perceived as cis as well. And I think that's something, unless, and if they're, and if, I think this goes to what Jen was saying about when you have cis men playing trans women, like it plays with this idea of transness and like this performative aspect, and like having audiences being like, ooh, what is happening? I think that's an unfortunate choice that that happens in a lot of places, where if the storyline is somebody who may be early in their medical transition, casting directors make really messy choices. And it relies on this idea that like people who are cis passing then are inherently more beautiful somehow in Hollywood's eyes. And that's the story they want to tell, because then also they can like ignore the person's transness or character's transness in a way that, I don't know.
Yeah, Alexandra, because I know Alexandra has been told she doesn't look trans enough to play trans parts.
Yeah, like super early on, like in my career, it was, honestly, I think because a lot of the scripts changed on some of the shows that I worked on, and it turned out to be a thing where it's like, okay, we're going to reveal, like, that's my thing, like shows love to reveal that I'm trans. And it's just like, I just kept hearing, there was been so many auditions in rows where I'm like, well, she's not trans enough. And, I'm just like, I don't know, what do you mean? You know what I mean? And so I would hear that a lot, that I wasn't trans enough. So, I don't know, right? Because, I'm still working my way through. I haven't been a series regular yet or anything like that. And, I'm gorgeous. But I think that, so I don't know, like, does that play a part, right? Like, I don't know, right? I can't say from my experience that it's helped me at all. It's actually, I think, hurt me in a lot of ways, but, I wouldn't change anything. But I think for sure that I've heard that several times, and I've been turned down from projects, and I haven't even been allowed to audition for certain things because they're like, well, she's too passable. So, yeah.
There was an interesting conversation where in a scene on the, like early on in the L Word, because folks who are familiar with the L Word, lots of shirtless stuff going on, lots of body showing. For me, as in my medical journey, I had a type of top surgery that does not leave the kind of scars that I think many people are familiar with. And that was a conversation we had. Like, is somebody gonna know by like looking at my chest because I acknowledge like I am often perceived as cis. And so like if that would have been maybe a whatever, that would have been a tell. And that was something that it was an interesting conversation to be a part of. I think like ultimately we did not choose to like add any sort of fake scarring because that's not genuine. But I mean, like, I think it's such an interesting thought process. Like I can't fully understand it. I get it, like from like logistically I get it, but like I can't understand that to me. I don't know. It's weird.
Can I just add that I think what it is, right? And this is just my, assumption based off my experiences. I think that people, I don't know if you want to say producers, showrunners, I'm not sure, right? I think they look at an actress like myself and it's like, okay, if we cast her in this trans role, what's going to be interesting about that, right? It's like, because she doesn't read as trans or visibly trans, whatever that means, right? It's like, so what would make Alexandra Gray interesting on this show, right? And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe put it in the writing, right? Like it's writing, and it talks about I'm transitioning or wherever you want to write, you know what I mean? It's like, then it doesn't have to be the shock factor of like seeing me, whatever. Like, I feel like that's the perception, is that it's like, if the audience cannot tell that this person was either this way or that way, it's like, then it's not really interesting. It's like, but I think I got blessed because it was like, well, she was probably the best actress for that role. So we got to cast her. So, I mean, we're moving in a more positive direction.
Thank you. We're really close to being out of time.
More questions. We love questions. More questions.
You're happy to continue?
I am. I can talk all night.
All right, well, I'll just check that I'm not about to get the word to wrap this thing up, but I hope not, because there are plenty of other questions too that have come in. So at least I'll throw to at least one more right now, and this is one I like, and it's addressed to some extent in the film, from Annie Lewis. When we discuss allyship, we are often referring to cis or straight people. But do you think other members of the LGBTQIPA community could learn how to be better allies to trans people?
Leo? I don't know. Who wants to take it?
Just, yeah. I don't know.
The short answer is yes.
I think, it's either not a secret, or some folks are okay with the transphobia and biphobia and erasure of certain identities in queer communities. And it's dangerous, and it really kind of takes away from this idea of sense of community for me. And so I would say, yeah, I'd say being like a cis queer person doesn't automatically make you an ally to trans folks, or mean that like, you accept this. I don't know. I don't know. Y'all have thoughts?
Well, I think, Yancey says really succinctly in Disclosure how, for a lot of gay and lesbian people, the movement has been about assimilation, or the goal has been assimilation. And I think for that part of the gay and lesbian community, then transness is, a kind of, it's not part of what they care about. And then, so I think that this idea that we're all like in, some big tent together is really not accurate. I think you really have to care about trans people. You have to care about all people. I think just by being gay or lesbian or bisexual does not mean you're necessarily progressive, or you understand who is left out and care about who is left out. So I think in a way that, allyship is really about caring about everyone, including everyone in consideration of equality not just those who can assimilate.
Perhaps a good starting point would be in this question from Mike Worsley, who asks, how important is it to have a trans writer / producer / director working on a production that features trans characters? Often we see issues portrayed and discussed without a trans person consulted. Is this just as important as casting trans people in trans roles? And this to me is a question of allyship. Perhaps it is to you as well. The importance of trans consultancy in trans storytelling? Sam?
You know, we credit our cast as creative consultants, but there's a line in the film where Trace Lissette talks about how you need to give trans people more credit, not just as consultants. And we just love that because it's so true. I think it's different in our situation, but so often we've seen projects credit trans people as consultants, and it's just, that's all they get. It's just the credit. Like they have not taken the notes, the advice that trans person has given. So again, until we see the power dynamic shifting, I think it is absolutely crucial that there's trans people behind the scenes. Because by the time it gets to casting, so much harm has already been done. You know, from the script to the directing, to the framing, to the lighting. I mean, we just know that there's a certain sensitivity you have in how you tell a story when you have a stake in it, right? When you have something on the line. And so, for example, there were particular details that my DP would only pick up on, my director of photography, because she was trans. Like there's just certain sensitivities she had and how, you know, we showed our cast on screen. So I think that can't be replaced by anything else. And until you give money to trans people, hire trans people, that's not going to change.
All right, well, I do have a sense that I ought to wrap this up soon and not keep you all over long, but perhaps I can pose this question courtesy of Taylor Kugel, who has asked, are you looking at creating a sequel to this? And are you considering expanding the scope into the history or impact of trans people in everyday work who may or may not be in a gender diverse workplace or one with policies and procedures to manage gender diversity? That's quite some undertaking, I think, but maybe can I even just throw to you as well, just the idea of, is there a sequel, possibly even a mini series to look at the history of representation more broadly outside of Hollywood and you know, go cast the net further afield? Would you be up for that challenge, Sam, Amy?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Leo, Alexandra?
Yeah, I think that I think it's just all important. I think the film itself is super, super important, and it's something that we definitely need. I think that it's already making a huge difference. A lot of casting directors have reached out to me personally and just expressed, you know, their thoughts about it and how beautiful the film was. And, you know, the roles have been coming through, honey, okay? In terms of, you know, like the auditions, you know what I mean? Like I'm getting all types of auditions coming through that I'm like, yes, finally, you know. And I think all of that is credit to this film and its popularity and, you know, the honesty. And so I think it's so important. And I would love to see, you know, a mini series. I know I've been hearing that. You know, I would love to see even more. But I think this really, you know, hits the what I'm trying to say. It hits the thing on the nail with this.
So
yeah, I agree. I was saying I agree. And I know you all gathered so much footage, and I continuously, I've seen it 3 times, and I watched the trailer once a day, if not once every other day, just because there's something about it that just feels like I feel it in my chest. And so to know the work you all put into it, if there's ever a mini series or anything, I know that would be incredible. And then it's incredible as a standalone too. I think y'all just, it's breathtaking.
My dream now for the miniseries, and I'm just going to talk it into I'm just going to manifest it.
Yeah, bring it.
Is that, so we collected over 600 television titles, 400 film titles, and have hours and hours and hours of interview footage. So we wouldn't even need to, we could even create a lot from just the material we have now. But I would love to do more interviews because there's so many other people that have so much to contribute to this conversation. But what my dream is to hire 5 different trans directors and oversee that process and have different directors direct each episode. I think that would be really awesome. And then of course, whole crews for each of those episodes that would prioritize trans crew people as well. That's my dream. So any funders who are psyched about that.
Yeah. All right, well, that's a wonderful note to end on, a note of optimism that there may be more, so much more yet to come. But in the meantime, Disclosure is a real treat for all folk who can readily access it on Netflix. Watch it again, learn, pay attention, and you folk out there in the wider world getting ready for your next production, employ trans folk. Employ them in every role. I must thank Queer Screen, Melbourne Queer Film Festival and Brisbane Queer Film Festival for making this conversation possible. Most of all, I must thank my extraordinary guests here today. So thank you so much, Sam Fader, Director of Disclosure, Amy Scholder, Producer of Disclosure, and prominent, wonderful cast members of that wonderful documentary, and who you can catch in so many other shows and moving image works besides Jen Richards, Leo Sheng, and Alexandra Gray. And perhaps everyone might like just to quickly flood the chat with little claps or some sort of feedback that you can give that we might all be able to see, just so that we know that you're all appreciative. That would be a lovely parting gesture from you, the audience here live in the moment, to this wonderful assemblage of magnificent talent. Thanks everyone for your time, and I look forward to seeing whatever comes next from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.